"This is what a real man looks like," she said, her smile aimed at Jason, her hand pressing against his waist as if it belonged there. The table went quiet. Coworkers shifted, unsure how to react. I raised my glass of bourbon, letting the amber liquid coat my tongue, forcing a faint smile that didn't reach my eyes. My silence unnerved her more than shouting ever could. The DJ started a new song. Jason tugged her onto the dance floor, sequins flashing as her laugh echoed like nails across glass. She thought she was untouchable, the star of the night. What she didn't know was that her downfall had begun weeks ago, quietly, methodically, as I observed, collected, and waited. Tonight, she gave me exactly what I was waiting for. There are sounds you don't forget because they're loud, but because they arrive at the exact moment something breaks. And for me, it wasn't the music or the applause or the clinking of champagne glasses that night at the Hyatt. It was Emily's laugh, bright, careless, and unmistakably not meant for me, that lodged itself in my chest and stayed there. The annual marketing gala was doing what it always did, dressing ego up as celebration. Golden lights strung overhead, bodies packed close, people drunk on status and open bars. But I barely noticed the spectacle because my attention was fixed on Emily. She stood out effortlessly in a silver dress that caught the light with every movement, auburn hair cascading down her back, confident in the way only someone adored by a room can be. And I remembered, briefly, how proud I used to feel walking beside her, how I once believed her attention was something earned, not borrowed. That memory didn't last. She leaned into Jason, too close, too familiar, and something tightened in my chest. Not rage, not yet, just a quiet internal warning. Then she said it. "Now this," her voice carrying cleanly over the music, "this is what a real man looks like." The room didn't freeze all at once, but it slowed in patches, laughter dying unevenly, eyes darting, people instinctively sensing they were witnessing something they'd remember later. Jason laughed, a little stunned, a little pleased, and his hand rested on her waist as if it belonged there, fingers pressing confidently into the fabric of her dress. And that was the moment the humiliation sharpened into clarity. I didn't look away. I didn't interrupt. I watched. I saw Hannah hide her smile behind a glass, saw phones subtly angle upward, red lights blinking as coworkers captured what they thought was harmless entertainment, and I understood, with chilling precision, that Emily wasn't teasing, wasn't drunk, wasn't careless. She was performing. I lifted my bourbon slowly, let the burn settle my breathing, and kept my face neutral, because fury is predictable, and silence unsettles people far more than shouting ever could. I felt her eyes flick toward me, just for a second, checking for damage, and when she didn't find it, she smiled wider, emboldened. The DJ announced the next song, and Jason pulled her toward the dance floor, spinning her under his arm as her laugh rang out again, louder now, sharper, and I noticed how easily the crowd accepted the narrative she was writing in real time. This wasn't a mistake. It was a message. As she danced, I wasn't thinking about how it looked, or what people would say tomorrow, or even how deeply it cut. I was thinking about the patterns that had been forming for months, the late nights that matched Jason's schedule, the calls that ended when I entered a room, the unfamiliar perfume she claimed belonged to coworkers, and how neatly they all aligned now that she'd stopped hiding. I didn't feel angry standing there. I felt focused. Because betrayal whispered in private is deniable, but betrayal delivered publicly is deliberate, and she had just crossed a line she couldn't step back over. Emily believed that moment was hers, that the room belonged to her, that I was a silent accessory to her triumph. But as I watched her laugh in Jason's arms, one thought settled in with absolute certainty. This wasn't the beginning of the end. It was the moment she handed me proof. And from that second on, everything was inevitable. The ride home from the gala was drenched in a silence so thick it almost pressed against my skin, yet I felt no anger, only the slow, precise hum of observation, cataloging every gesture, every flicker of expression Emily left in her wake, from the careless laugh on the dance floor to the way her perfume lingered in the car long after she claimed it was just the team. I kept my hands steady on the wheel, eyes on the road, heart calculating, noting the rhythm of her voice, the tilt of her head, the way she thought she had already won, blissfully unaware that each chuckle, each smug comment, each fleeting glance she threw toward me had been quietly recorded, captured in photos she thought were private, text messages printed and left on the home printer, receipts from dinners she assumed I hadn't noticed, and little logs of attention she'd given to Jason, all of it thickening into a pattern that would not be ignored, that would not be forgiven, that would cascade into consequences she couldn't yet see. Emily hummed lightly, tossing her hair back, her heels off, bare feet brushing the dashboard, utterly convinced she had humiliated me. Yet with each movement, each careless smile, I felt a flicker of something that felt like irony, a pang that reminded me this was not just strategy. It was life unraveling slowly before her eyes, and I let it happen in silence, savoring the power of invisibility, the weight of restraint, because fury is loud and fleeting, and I had learned that men who explode lose the game, whereas men who remain silent can move mountains. And in this quiet, I was already moving 3 steps ahead, orchestrating a reckoning that would feel inevitable to her once the first domino fell. By the time we reached home, she was still riding her imagined victory, pulling her phone from her purse, scrolling through clips, comments, emojis flying, tagging friends, unaware that the same images she flaunted were being forwarded to eyes she could never anticipate, and that a simple message, short, factual, void of accusation, had already begun its journey to the one person whose authority could dismantle her perceived control. A ripple that would become a wave by Monday morning. As she stepped into the house, cheerful, stretching into my hoodie, stealing pieces of toast, narrating every hilarious comment she received like a trophy, I kept my own reaction minimal, letting the calm unsettle her more than a shout ever could, letting her believe she had me contained, that her power was unchallenged, while I quietly arranged the pieces on the board, aligning them so that when the inevitable meeting arrived, she would see the breadth of what she had ignored, of what she had created through arrogance and careless pride. And in the quiet kitchen, while she recounted every laugh, every playful jab, I felt the faintest flicker of satisfaction at the meticulous timing, the inevitability of it all, because the game was no longer hers to play. And as she finally wandered upstairs, satisfied with her own cunning, I sat at the counter, pouring coffee, fingers brushing over a laptop ready to send, reminders of patterns she had left in plain sight, and with each microsecond the first domino was already tipping, a subtle vibration she would soon feel ripple through her life, and she would realize, far too late, that while she celebrated small victories, the real consequences had been quietly moving, unseen, unstoppable. And when the morning came, she would know that her empire was no longer hers, and all I had done was wait, watch, and let the truth speak. And by then, there would be no one to blame but herself. The morning after the gala, the house felt quieter than usual, the kind of silence that carries its own weight, a subtle reminder that the night had changed something irrevocable. And while Emily moved through the rooms as if nothing had shifted, pouring coffee, scrolling her phone, humming lightly to herself, every detail I observed became a marker, a thread in the web I had been quietly weaving for weeks. The emails she thought were private now queued, the photos she flaunted safely tucked into messages already on their way to those whose authority she could not challenge. And with each sip of coffee I took, I felt the tension in her posture, the slight tremor in her hands as she angled her laptop, checking comments, laughing at herself, believing she was untouchable, believing the gala's mockery had been harmless. And yet, across the city, unseen by her, the first responses were landing, short, factual, unshakable, each ping a quiet hammer against the foundation of her confidence. And as I watched, I felt that subtle thrill of inevitability, that sense that patience, restraint, and precision always yield outcomes far sharper than any outburst, that her laughter, the same one that had once burned me like fire, would now turn brittle and hollow as she realized she had miscalculated every step, that while she thought she played the game, she had been a pawn in a plan she never suspected. And I let her continue in her false victory, letting her sense of control grow even as the walls were quietly closing in, because I knew that when the first domino fell, the rest would follow with a force she could not arrest, and I had timed it so meticulously that by the moment she lifted her glass to toast another imagined triumph, the cascade had already begun, moving faster than her perception, and she would see it only when there was no turning back, no excuses, no charm to save her. And as she glanced toward me, expecting some reaction, some acknowledgement of the power she assumed she wielded, I remained calm, composed, unreadable, allowing her to misinterpret my silence, while inside I catalogued every small movement, every word she typed, every post she shared, every smile she offered the world, because all of it was a breadcrumb trail leading to this moment, the hinge on which her fate would pivot. And as the morning sun poured through the kitchen window, casting light across her hair, highlighting the careless confidence she still clung to, I prepared the final pieces, hitting send on the last batch of attachments, concise, factual, and lethal in their clarity. And with a quiet breath, I leaned back, watching the screen, hearing the subtle pings of acknowledgement, knowing that within hours her carefully constructed facade would fracture, her laughter would fade, and the world she thought she controlled would shift beneath her feet. And in that calm, quiet pause before the storm, I felt the first true flicker of satisfaction, not from revenge, not from cruelty, but from the inevitability of justice delivered precisely, silently, and without fanfare. And as Emily remained oblivious, still scrolling, still smiling, still believing she had triumphed, I knew that by the end of today she would finally understand that the quiet man she had mocked had already moved mountains around her, and there would be no coming back, only the slow, undeniable realization that the game had been hers to lose, and she had lost it before she even realized it. By midday, the subtle tremors of reality began to ripple through Emily's carefully constructed world, though she remained blissfully unaware at first, moving through her morning routine as if nothing had shifted, selecting a scarf, checking emails, sipping coffee, humming under her breath. But every movement betrayed the smallest hint of unease, a slight hesitation when her phone buzzed, a micro-adjustment of her hair as if to remind herself of the flawless image she projected, while I observed from the kitchen counter, noting every breath, every glance, every carefully placed smile, knowing that each one was slowly unraveling the armor she had spent years perfecting. And as the notifications pinged across devices she assumed were private, each brief acknowledgement from the executives, HR, and department heads landed like a silent hammer strike against her confidence, her eyes flickering to the screen, catching only fragments of subject lines, reading snippets that didn't yet convey the full force of the storm, but enough to prick at her certainty. And as she moved toward the living room to make a casual call, her hand paused midair, phone hovering, hesitation cutting through her practiced nonchalance like a sharp knife. And I could see her mind working overtime, trying to rationalize, justify, spin the narrative, to convince herself this was a minor inconvenience, a hiccup in an otherwise flawless performance. Yet the subtle tension in her shoulders, the tight line of her jaw, betrayed the slow infiltration of doubt, the realization that her world was no longer entirely within her grasp. And while she laughed into the phone, a hollow, brittle sound that lacked conviction, I knew the pattern of weeks-long observation, meticulous collection of evidence, and precise timing was reaching its crescendo. And as she ended the call, tucking her phone into her bag with deliberate care, the corners of her eyes betrayed the first flicker of panic,
the recognition that control was slipping like sand through her fingers. And I remained calm, sipping my coffee, masking the satisfaction that bubbled quietly beneath the surface, because in this game, patience was more potent than anger, and timing was everything. And every second that she spent clinging to her illusion of power only ensured that the eventual impact would be absolute. And as she rearranged the living room, straightening pillows, brushing crumbs from the counter, each micro-action was an attempt to assert control, to maintain the image of dominance and composure. But beneath it all, cracks had already formed, subtle but undeniable, and they were spreading faster than she could perceive. And I watched her glide from room to room, masking anxiety with practiced charm, unaware that by the end of the day, the first undeniable confrontation would arrive, not with shouts, not with drama, but in the cold, professional precision of emails, official notices, and calls she could no longer influence. And as she paused by the window, gazing out at the world she thought she owned, a brief flicker of fear crossed her face before she forced a smile, trying to convince herself that all was as it had always been. But I knew better, knew that the avalanche had begun, the first domino had tipped, and Emily, in all her brilliance and charm, was only just beginning to understand that the quiet observer she had underestimated was already 3 steps ahead. And by nightfall, the illusion of untouchable triumph she clung to would crumble, and the quiet, unassuming architect of this reckoning would remain patient, poised, and merciless, letting truth speak louder than any confrontation ever could.
The morning arrived like any other, sunlight streaming through the blinds, casting sharp lines across the kitchen floor. But beneath that ordinary calm, a quiet storm was brewing, one that Emily remained almost completely oblivious to as she prepared her coffee, her movements deliberate and practiced, hair perfectly arranged, blazer pressed, heels clicking against the tile, projecting control even as subtle tremors of unease flickered across her expression. And I sat across from her, hands wrapped around my mug, observing, noting every shift in posture, every flicker in her eyes, the way her fingers lingered a second too long on the edge of the counter, the faint hesitation in her voice as she joked about the gala, attempting to mask the rising tension she didn't fully understand. And yet, despite her efforts, the first undeniable consequence of her actions had already begun to unfold, quietly, invisibly, like smoke filling a room before a fire is noticed. My fingers brushing the edge of my laptop where an email had already been scheduled to send, subject line simple, precise. Professional conduct, multiple employees present, public setting, evidence attached. No anger, no accusation, just fact. A single ripple that would expand across her carefully curated professional world. And as she scrolled through her phone, oblivious to the ticking clock and the messages queued, I could see the first hint of panic surface in the tiniest quiver of her lips, a hesitation in the laugh she offered to me, a forced brightness that failed to reach her eyes, because she assumed control, assumed charm could shield her, when in reality the wheels of consequence had already been set in motion, and every notification, every ping she ignored or dismissed was another domino poised to fall. And I remained calm, outwardly serene, letting the quiet patience of observation replace impulse, knowing that the right moment, not anger or confrontation, would deliver the full impact. And she moved through the morning, making calls, rearranging her desk, answering emails with practiced efficiency, all while her internal clock raced faster than she realized, small beads of doubt forming and connecting, invisible to anyone else, but unmistakable to me. And as I reviewed the final attachments one last time, screenshots, photos, messages, receipts, meticulously compiled, all time-stamped and labeled, the magnitude of what she had triggered by her arrogance became tangible. And by the time she walked into the office, smiling as if nothing had changed, the first domino fell in the form of a meeting request that carried more weight than her entire performance at the gala. And when she entered the glass-walled conference room to find HR, the department head, and legal waiting, the carefully constructed world she had relied upon for influence, for charm, for leverage, collapsed silently, methodically, each page of evidence a hammer strike. And while she tried to maintain composure, forcing a smile,
crossing her legs, sitting tall. The truth of the avalanche she had set off began to pierce the veil of control. And in that moment, the first true lesson settled into her bones. Charisma cannot shield someone from consequences meticulously prepared, and silence, patience, and foresight, wielded quietly, are far more powerful than any theatrics of charm.
Emily's heels clicked against the polished office floor with deliberate precision, but each step seemed heavier than the last, as if gravity had shifted just for her, and I watched from a distance, noting the subtle tension in her shoulders, the way her hands tightened around her purse, knuckles pale, the confident mask she had perfected over years starting to fracture under the invisible pressure of a storm she couldn't control. And when she slid open the conference room door, the sterile glass walls amplified every echo of her movements, the smell of polished wood and corporate coffee blending into an atmosphere suddenly charged with unspoken authority. HR seated with pens poised, the department head leaning back with arms folded, eyes calm but uncompromising, and the lawyer, expression carved from marble, all three silent as she took her place at the table, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes, as if rehearsing a scene that might save her. And I could see in that moment the first flicker of genuine uncertainty, the realization that the world she had controlled with charm and laughter had quietly tilted beneath her. While outside her bubble, notifications buzzed and emails were read, forwarding the truth further into the hands of those empowered to act. And every screenshot, every time-stamped message, every casual remark she had dismissed as office humor was now a weapon, precise and unyielding, waiting to strike. And as the first page of evidence was laid before her, showing her arm around Jason with the caption she had thought playful but was now damning, a shiver passed through her composure, subtle, almost imperceptible to anyone else, but unmistakable to me, because I had learned to read the silence between words, the hesitation between breaths. And Emily's breath caught slightly, lips parting, a faltering in her practiced rhythm of confidence. And she tried to recover, flipping through the following pages of messages, images, and receipts, each one a silent verdict. And I could almost hear the gears of her mind spinning, desperately seeking an escape, an excuse, a loophole. But the careful web of observation, patience, and foresight I had spun weeks ago allowed no gap, no shadow, no pause for charm to manipulate. And while she attempted to interject, to spin, to distract, the calm authority of HR and legal allowed no interruption, no room for theatrics, no softening of impact. And each denied opportunity chipped away at her bravado until the veneer of control that had served her so well for years was reduced to a brittle shell, cracking quietly, invisibly, under the weight of meticulously documented truth. And I remained outside the storm, sipping my coffee, breathing evenly, the satisfaction of precision and patience, not in triumph, but in the inevitability of consequence, watching as the first cracks spread across Emily's carefully constructed armor, knowing that the quietest moves often wield the most absolute power, and that by the time she left that conference room, the lesson would be ingrained. Arrogance, charm, and assumed invincibility are fragile things, and when confronted with patience and evidence, even the most untouchable fall quietly, systematically, leaving nothing but the echo of inevitability.
The morning sun streamed through the blinds, cutting sharp lines across the kitchen floor as Emily moved with hesitant steps, a quiet storm cloud trailing her usual bravado, her phone vibrating relentlessly with notifications she couldn't ignore, the once invisible chains of consequence tightening with every ping. And I watched from the table, coffee cooling in my hand, laptop open, fingers poised but unmoving, because there was no rush, no need for theatrics. The system I had set in motion was already working. Emails sent, screenshots forwarded, a chain reaction spreading across departments, whispers igniting, forwarding, escalating, each message a precise strike against the illusion of control she had clung to. And she didn't notice my calm, didn't see the strategy in my measured gaze, only the quiet patience that unnerved her more than any confrontation ever could. As she tried to laugh, tried to mask the tremor in her voice, scrolling through comments, forwarding texts, even attempting casual conversation. "Did you see this?" she asked, handing me her phone, expecting reassurance, expecting me to share in her relief. But I didn't. Not a flicker, not a nod, my silence a blade, sharper than words. And with each notification she opened, she felt the walls closing in. HR arranging meetings, department heads copying in executives, compliance reviewing logs, and the empire she had built on charm and selective memory crumbled page by page, timestamp by timestamp, each digital trace a hammer striking the foundations of her certainty. And while she clung to routines, pouring coffee, setting the table, acting as if the world outside the kitchen were normal, the reality was irreversible, her control evaporating in real time. And when she finally looked up, catching my eyes across the table, the mask faltered, a momentary flicker of panic, regret, disbelief, fear. A cocktail she had never allowed herself to taste surfaced, and I didn't speak, didn't console, didn't intervene, because the avalanche doesn't pause for emotion. It rolls forward, inevitable, consuming. And by the time she realized the gravity of her exposure, by the time she understood that every flirtatious laugh, every careless message, every private joke had been meticulously logged, archived, and weaponized, the consequences were already in motion, unstoppable. And I remained the calm eye at the center of the storm, observing, patient, knowing the first domino had fallen, the second poised to follow, and that the moment she would try to negotiate, argue, or spin her way out of it would have passed, leaving only the cold, unyielding reality that even the brightest star, the one everyone admired and envied, could be reduced to a flicker, a shadow, a cautionary tale, all without a single raised voice, all without a dramatic confrontation, simply by anticipation, calculation, and the quiet execution of truth, leaving her stunned, exposed, and helpless as the avalanche rolled forward, unstoppable. And I sipped my coffee slowly, letting the scene unfold exactly as it had been designed. By mid-morning, the office had transformed into a quiet battlefield, the usual hum of keyboards and low conversations replaced by an almost tangible tension, whispers curling around cubicles like smoke as Emily approached the building with heels clicking sharply against the polished floors, her blazer pressed, hair immaculately styled. Each step betraying a mixture of determination and doubt, and I could see her posture tightened as she passed colleagues who avoided her gaze, the very air charged with unspoken awareness of what was about to unfold. HR already prepared in the glass-walled conference room, her department heads seated with arms crossed, the company lawyer's expression carved in stone, a living reminder that rules and evidence wield more power than charm or smiles. And she faltered only slightly on the threshold, expecting perhaps a polite conversation, a casual reprimand, something she could spin. But the weight of the folder on the table, stacked with photos, screenshots, timestamps, and printed messages, made it immediately clear that this was no ordinary review. And as the lawyer flipped the first page, the gala photo appeared, her arm around Jason's waist, sequins sparkling, timestamp bold, captioned, "Now this is what a real man looks like." And I could almost hear the mental shudder click in her mind as she realized her joke had become formal evidence. Every laughter-filled comment, every teasing remark, every careless text weaponized, leaving no escape, no soft landing. And the HR officer leaned forward, voice neutral, stating the facts. Suspension effective immediately. Surrender of laptop, badge, and access. While the lawyer methodically presented private messages pulled from the company server, metadata attached, devices logged, locations verified, every detail stripping away her authority, her control, her empire. And she tried to maintain composure, adjusting her hair, straightening her posture, offering half smiles that didn't reach her eyes, but each gesture fell flat against the relentless weight of evidence. The conference room silent except for the faint rustle of papers, her pen trembling as she signed the suspension form, a record of her collapse. And as she left the building,
access revoked, contacts deactivated, laptop locked, her empire reduced to fragments she could no longer command, I watched from afar, calm, unshaken, the quiet strategist who had set each domino with precision, knowing that the avalanche I had anticipated weeks ago had reached the point of no return. Emily's pride shattered, not through confrontation or anger, but through careful observation, meticulous documentation, and patience. And when she called me later, voice thin, frantic, stripped of the gala arrogance, pleading for guidance, I responded only with measured calm, letting the silence reinforce the lesson she had ignored for months. The quiet man moves mountains, and now she would feel the weight of every choice, every misstep, and every false confidence that led to this day. As I sipped my coffee, eyes on the screen, already 3 steps ahead, while she processed the first real taste of consequences.
The moment Emily stepped out of the building, the streets outside seemed quieter, the usual bustle muted, as if the world itself had taken notice of her sudden exile, and I could almost see the weight pressing down on her shoulders as she walked to her car, heels clicking less confidently, hair slightly disheveled, makeup no longer a mask of control, every glance from passers-by a reminder that the carefully curated image she had spent years building was crumbling. And as she drove home, the radio seemed distant, traffic lights blurred, notifications from colleagues pinging in her phone that she had already deactivated too late, emails she could no longer access piling up. Every social interaction that day filtered through the lens of her sudden vulnerability, while inside our house, I moved with the same calm precision that had defined my every action, coffee in hand, laptop open, monitoring the ripple of her downfall. And when she entered the kitchen, tossing her keys on the counter, she wore sweatpants, loose hair, eyes wide and frantic, a fragile mask of composure trying desperately to hold the pieces together. But the tension between us was thicker than any words could penetrate, and her first attempts at casual conversation, questions about breakfast, comments on the weather, small jokes to mask fear, fell flat, my silence a mirror reflecting the reality she refused to acknowledge. And when she finally asked if I had spoken to her attorney or anyone at the company, I responded only with measured calm, letting the pause stretch long enough to unsettle her further, the quiet hammering harder than any shouted accusation, while her mind raced through possible explanations, excuses, and spins that could somehow undo what had already been set in motion. And she drifted through the house like a ghost of the confident woman who had mocked me at the gala, pausing at the counters, peeking at her phone, glancing at the clock, as if time itself were conspiring to remind her of the irreversible consequences. And as I watched from the living room, each movement deliberate, I knew she would come to understand that her laughter, her arrogance, her assumed immunity had all been recorded, catalogued, and set against her in a way that no charm, apology, or excuse could erase. And the irony was almost poetic. She had believed she was untouchable, that her social victories mattered more than the quiet vigilance of someone she underestimated. And now she sat at the kitchen table, hands trembling, coffee cooling untouched, replaying every humiliating moment in her mind, trying to predict my next move, unaware that I had already orchestrated every step, ensuring that each domino would fall precisely as planned, that every person who needed to see the truth already had, that the storm she thought she could weather alone was already raging around her. And as the sun dipped behind the trees outside, casting long shadows across the floor, I allowed her a moment of illusion, a brief opportunity to confront her fear, to see the extent of her isolation, and to recognize that the quiet man she had mocked possessed a power measured not in volume or anger, but in patience, observation, and an unshakable will. And in that silence she began to comprehend the full scale of the reckoning she could neither control nor escape.
Monday morning arrived with the usual hum of fluorescent lights, printers, and murmuring coworkers. But for Emily, the office was no longer a playground of power. It had become a labyrinth where every step reminded her of the cracks she had ignored. And as she entered the glass doors, briefcase in hand, heels echoing unnervingly across the polished floors, her confident stride faltered for the first time in months. The smiles of colleagues once warm now tinged with curiosity and quiet judgment, whispers brushing past her ears like invisible knives. And when she reached her department, the familiar hum of chatter had been replaced by silence, the desks arranged as if the office itself were bracing for her arrival. And then the first message popped on her screen, time-stamped, official, and unmistakable. All access revoked pending review, followed by a cascade of automated notifications stripping her of privileges, forwarding emails she could no longer recall sending, and opening doors she could no longer enter. Her heart beating faster with each confirmation, hands trembling slightly as she touched her badge, realizing in an instant that her control was gone, replaced by rules, policies, and people she had always assumed would be deferential. And while she scanned her department, she caught fleeting eye contact from colleagues, some sympathetic, others shocked, most silently acknowledging the unspoken story unfolding before them. And the building's HR manager arrived shortly after, professional, stoic, carrying a folder with documents detailing her missteps, timestamps, screenshots, and messages that even Emily could not spin into charm or humor. And as she was led into the glass-walled conference room, each step heavier than the last, her mind raced, replaying every gala laugh, every careless comment, every subtle betrayal she had orchestrated thinking no one noticed, while outside, the office continued its rhythm, unaware or unwilling to intervene, leaving her entirely alone to face the consequences of actions she had assumed were harmless, trivial, or easily forgotten. And as the HR officer, company lawyer, and department head laid out the evidence, each item precise, undeniable, she felt the walls of her carefully constructed world collapse, realizing that the hierarchy she relied on, the influence she wielded, and the persona she perfected for years were powerless against documentation, accountability, and silent strategy. And for the first time she understood that games played with arrogance and laughter could be weaponized against her, that casual cruelty and public mockery were being recorded and scrutinized, and that the quiet man she had underestimated, the one she thought so predictable and restrained, had already calculated every move to the last detail, leaving her with no options, no defenses, no charm to salvage the situation. And as she left the meeting, signature on the suspension notice still fresh, the air outside crisp and unforgiving, she realized that her social victories, the laughter at my expense, the gala's fleeting admiration, had all led to a personal and professional collapse. And Daniel, calm, collected, and patient, watched it unfold, knowing that the dominoes had started falling and there would be no stopping them until the reckoning was complete.
The day stretched on like a taut wire, each hour amplifying Emily's awareness of how fragile her carefully curated world had become. And as she moved through the office, the whispers she had once dismissed as inconsequential now struck like small hammers against her confidence, her colleagues avoiding eye contact or offering faint, knowing glances. And the once familiar hum of keyboards and printers seemed almost accusatory, as if the building itself had turned sentient, recording every misstep she made. While Daniel's presence, though invisible, hovered in every decision, in every carefully timed email sent to compliance, and in the unseen but undeniable currents moving through the corporate hierarchy. And Emily felt it immediately, a creeping sense of vulnerability that no amount of rehearsed charm could mask. Her phone buzzed relentlessly with notifications she dared not check, her inbox filling with meeting requests and memos that left no room for improvisation, each one a reminder that the gala was no longer a distant memory, but the catalyst of a storm she had underestimated. And as she tried to salvage fragments of normalcy, replying to colleagues with forced politeness, laughing lightly at jokes she no longer found amusing, she noticed subtle shifts. The quiet pauses when she entered rooms, the half-smiles that didn't reach the eyes, the screens angled just enough to hide the conversations now filtering through the company chat.
And even the office plants seemed to occupy space differently, shadows stretching longer in corners where she used to feel comfortable. And as the afternoon crept in, HR summoned her again, calm but deliberate, presenting additional documentation, now with corroborating accounts from coworkers, timestamps aligned with her gala interactions, and explicit references to comments once brushed off as office humor. And while the weight of the evidence pressed on her, Daniel remained a phantom architect of consequence, orchestrating every move with patience, precision, and absolute control. The quiet storm that had been building for weeks now crashing against her with relentless certainty. And Emily's attempts to explain, to soften, to justify were met with professional neutrality, the law and policy indifferent to her social victories, her laughter at Daniel, the dance floor display, and her confident assertions now weaponized against her. While outside the glass walls, life continued. Phones chimed, elevators dinged, conversations flowed. But for her, the office was a cage of inevitability. And by evening, when she returned home, blazer slightly rumpled, heels clicking with less confidence, she realized that the game she had thought she was winning had shifted entirely. That Daniel's strategy was not vengeance, but calculated balance, a demonstration of accountability. And the quiet man she had mocked and underestimated had become the unseen architect of her reckoning, leaving her to face not only professional consequences, but the disorienting realization that she had never fully understood the depth of patience, observation, and controlled power. And as she sank onto the sofa, exhaustion heavy in her limbs, she understood with chilling clarity that her life, her career, and her illusions of control were no longer hers to manage, that the storm had arrived, and there was no negotiation, only the undeniable force of consequence, measured, inevitable, and devastating in its quiet perfection.
The morning light filtered through the kitchen blinds, casting long, sharp shadows across the countertop as Emily moved mechanically, pouring coffee, scrolling through her phone, and pretending that nothing had changed. But every notification, every muted buzz reminded her that the world she had controlled so effortlessly was now shifting beneath her feet. And Daniel, calm and collected at the kitchen table, observed with an almost clinical patience, sipping his coffee while every subtle detail, the tension in her shoulders, the fleeting hesitation in her gaze, the way her fingers trembled slightly over the phone, fed his strategy. And Emily, desperate for reassurance or an ally, glanced at him, searching for the familiar spark of approval or camaraderie, only to find a quiet void, a measured detachment that unsettled her far more than confrontation ever could. And as the minutes stretched into hours, her phone rang with the first official notice from HR, formal, impersonal, every word stripping away layers of influence and authority she had once wielded effortlessly. And the office that had been her stage now seemed hostile, every hallway echoing with the faint laughter of colleagues who once admired her, while the screenshots, emails, and video clips that Daniel had compiled and sent strategically to compliance were already moving through channels beyond her comprehension. And as she dressed for the day, smoothing hair, selecting a blazer that once made her feel untouchable, she caught a glimpse of her reflection and barely recognized the tense, anxious woman staring back, the confident facade cracked, revealing uncertainty and fear she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. And when she stepped into the elevator, the eyes of coworkers barely concealed curiosity and judgment, small smiles and subtle whispers following her like ghosts. And each passing floor reminded her that the gala, the laughter, the display of control she had so proudly orchestrated had been the opening act in a story she no longer authored. And as she approached the conference room, she felt the weight of inevitability pressing on her chest. HR, department heads, and legal counsel seated and waiting, their presence immovable, their documents neatly arranged like weapons, each timestamp, screenshot, and report a testament to a meticulous plan unfolding with surgical precision. And while she opened her mouth to explain, to charm, to twist the narrative, no words could bridge the gap between perception and consequence, between arrogance and accountability.
And as the meeting commenced, every denial and justification she offered was met with calm, factual responses, the law indifferent to charm, humor, or excuses. And in that moment, she understood the depth of the quiet man's patience. That Daniel's calm had been the ire of a storm she hadn't anticipated, a storm that now swept through her career, her identity, and her carefully constructed reality, leaving her stunned, exposed, and utterly aware that the personal and professional boundaries she once manipulated were now controlled by someone whose strategy was flawless, unyielding, and invisible until the consequences landed with devastating precision.
By the time Emily returned home that evening, the weight of the day had settled into the corners of the house like a thick fog, her heels echoing on the hardwood as if each step announced her failure to the walls themselves. And Daniel, sitting at the kitchen island with his laptop open, glanced up only briefly, offering no comfort, no acknowledgement beyond a faint nod, his calm presence a mirror of the quiet inevitability she had yet to fully comprehend. And Emily, clutching her bag and loosening her tie of control, felt the first true pang of isolation, realizing that every confident word she had spoken, every joke at the office, every display of social dominance had been documented, analyzed, and weaponized. And she attempted small talk as she unpacked groceries, her voice lighter than she felt, forcing laughter, smiling at Daniel when he raised his cup in silent greeting. Yet inside, panic simmered. Every message she had sent and every casual whisper at the gala now glowing red in her mind like warnings. And Daniel's eyes, calm and unreadable, tracked every subtle movement, every micro-expression, cataloging her disbelief, her anxiety, her futile attempts to normalize a day that had already shattered her control. And as she poured wine, trying to recreate the illusion of normalcy, Daniel silently reviewed the flow of information he had orchestrated. The emails, the photos, the timestamps, the chain of custody that ensured compliance would act with unerring speed. And Emily, unaware of the precision behind each domino, spoke about mundane things, about the farmer's market, about neighbors, about small victories that now rang hollow in a house charged with quiet tension. And when her phone buzzed, she froze, a faint tremor running through her fingers as she instinctively glanced at Daniel, half expecting a warning, a comforting reassurance, a hint that she still held influence. But Daniel didn't flinch, didn't react, only continued his meticulous, calm observation, letting the moments stretch, letting her anxiety ferment naturally. And as she scrolled through notifications, seeing the subtle ripple of gossip, the emails from HR, the whispers of colleagues already planning how to navigate the aftermath, she realized that control was no longer hers, that the quiet, measured man beside her had already anticipated every misstep, every excuse, every charm offensive. And while she had believed the gala was the battleground, the true reckoning had occurred in silence, through patience, through foresight, through strategy so invisible that it had allowed her to strut, to laugh, to taunt, unaware that her downfall was already sealed. And now, in the quiet of her own home, every smile she forced, every casual word, every toast she lifted, was met with the steady, unshakable presence of a man who had mastered the art of waiting, of watching, and of letting the storm arrive without warning, leaving her to feel its full force when it could no longer be denied.
Monday morning arrived like a quiet verdict, the sun filtering through the blinds but failing to illuminate the tension that clung to the walls, and Emily, dressed meticulously as if armor could shield her from what was coming, stepped into the office with heels clicking sharply against the polished floors, eyes scanning familiar faces that now carried an unfamiliar weight, whispers brushing past her like cold drafts, while Daniel,
calm and methodical, had already ensured that the first wave of consequences was in motion. Emails sent, compliance notified, evidence compiled, and she, blissfully unaware of the precision behind every move, assumed the meeting with HR would be a formality, a bureaucratic tick in the day's agenda. Yet, as she approached the glass-walled conference room, she noticed the unusual number of people gathered. HR officers, her department head, and a corporate lawyer whose expression could carve through stone. And her confident stride faltered, replaced by a hesitation she hadn't felt in years, because the folder neatly stacked on the table wasn't just paperwork, it was the story of her own hubris, photographed, documented, and annotated, capturing every word, every laugh, every moment she had believed she was untouchable. And as the first high-resolution image was revealed, time-stamped and sharp, showing her arm looped around Jason with the caption, "Now this is what a real man looks like," the room's atmosphere thickened, stifling, each click of her heels as she sat down echoing like a guilty verdict, and every screenshot from group chats, every private message she thought secure, was presented with metadata, location, device, sender, recipient, leaving no room for charm, spin, or excuses. Her attempts at humor evaporating instantly under the weight of cold, precise evidence. And when the HR officer declared that she was suspended effective immediately, her badge, laptop, and building access revoked, the illusion of control shattered, leaving her trembling, reaching for explanations that weren't coming, as Daniel's quiet orchestration of the past weeks manifested fully, demonstrating that patience, observation, and methodical execution could achieve what confrontation never could. And as she signed the suspension form, each shaky stroke of her pen felt like a confession, a surrender, a record of a fall she hadn't anticipated, while Daniel, miles away in calm observation, knew the storm he had unleashed was only beginning, that the ripple effects of this one carefully orchestrated morning would touch colleagues, executives, and every corner of the corporate structure she had relied on. And yet she, the star of the gala, the queen of attention, sat defeated in silence, stripped of influence, prestige, and the carefully constructed mask of invincibility she had worn so effortlessly, finally realizing that the quiet man she underestimated had not only been ahead of her every move, but had also ensured that the reckoning arrived in a manner she could neither control nor mitigate, leaving her to confront the full force of consequences she had blindly courted for months.
The hours after Emily's suspension stretched like a taut wire, each tick of the clock amplifying the quiet chaos that had replaced her once orderly life, and she moved through the house like a ghost, still dressed in office attire, blazer sharp, hair perfect, as if the external appearance could shield her from the storm of reality bearing down, while Daniel observed from the kitchen, calm, deliberate, sipping coffee and letting the silence speak louder than words, because he knew the power of quiet. Emily's phone buzzed incessantly, notifications piling up with messages from colleagues, lawyers, and HR, each one a hammer striking at the walls of certainty she had built around herself. And she tried to respond, to explain, to spin a narrative, but no words could undo the meticulously documented evidence that now defined her professional existence, and every attempt to regain composure only revealed cracks, a tremor in her hands, a falter in her voice, a nervous glance toward the one person who had orchestrated it all without raising his tone or revealing the depth of his strategy, while Daniel's presence remained steady, an unmovable anchor in the middle of her unraveling storm, watching her struggle to reconcile pride with humiliation, arrogance with vulnerability, and control with the helplessness that now filled the spaces she once dominated. And when she finally sank onto the couch, exhausted and defeated, Daniel merely set down his coffee, eyes steady, expression neutral, knowing she had reached the precise moment he had foreseen, the point at which realization becomes undeniable and the lessons are internalized not through confrontation but through the undeniable clarity of consequences. And Emily, for all her previous confidence, could only stare at the floor, tracing patterns in the wood grain as if answers could be found there, while Daniel reflected quietly that power is rarely asserted with noise.
It is executed with patience, precision, and foresight. And in that silent house, two lives had crossed paths in a game of observation and strategy, leaving one humbled, shaken, and irrevocably altered, and the other composed, methodical, and already planning the next step in a world where control had shifted quietly but completely.
Wednesday morning arrived quiet, almost deceptively so, with sunlight spilling across the kitchen counter where Daniel sipped his coffee, methodical and unhurried, while Emily lingered in the living room, swaying slightly as if the weight of the past days could bend her but not yet break her, eyes fixed on her laptop, trembling fingers hovering over keys that no longer held command over her world. And when the email came from the CEO, subject line blunt and unembellished, "Your employment is terminated effective immediately," she froze, reality cracking the mask she had worn for months, a thin, sharp gasp escaping her lips as her empire, once carefully curated and defended, dissolved in an instant. And Daniel watched, silently, arms crossed, the quiet satisfaction of precision evident but not boastful, knowing that victories of this sort require patience, observation, and restraint, the kind that makes confrontation obsolete. While Emily's phone rang endlessly, voicemails piling like stones on her chest, each one a reminder that charm, excuses, and laughter could not undo documented truth. And when she finally called him, voice breaking, panicked, stripped of arrogance, asking if he had done this, Daniel's tone remained calm, professional, and absolute, the kind of voice that delivers reality without anger, but with irrefutable clarity. And Emily could feel for the first time that she had misjudged him entirely, believing him quiet meant submission, when in fact it had been calculated, deliberate, and unstoppable. And hours stretched into a tense stillness as she tried to regain footing, cooking dinner with hands shaking, voice faltering. But the silence between them spoke louder than any confrontation could, because power in its quietest form is not loud, it is immutable. And Daniel understood that letting events unfold without interference only heightened the lesson, teaching her that the world does not bend to charm or laughter, but to consequence and preparation. And as evening descended, she sat alone, defeated and stripped of control, realizing the connections she relied upon, the influence she assumed she had, the laughter she thought invincible, all rendered powerless by a man who observed, waited, and acted when the moment was inevitable. While Daniel, finally stepping onto the back porch with his last sip of coffee, breathed the cool air, chest lighter than it had been in months, not triumphant, but relieved, because justice in its quietest form had been delivered. The storm had passed, and the reckoning was complete, leaving one woman humbled and irrevocably altered, and one man serene, methodical, and in control. The story of betrayal and patience closing with a single silent truth: quiet men often move mountains while the world sleeps.